Good morning, everyone. In this Monday morning, beginning the week, I'm very pleased to begin this intercultural, intercontinental meeting and also interdisciplinary. So here we have the presence of representatives from different ethnicities, different people from different continents, and also those who are going to help us create these bridges between these different talks and these contributions that will happen after the talk of our special guest, Professor Mariko Murata. I'm very, very pleased to receive you. She's traveled the whole world to be here with us. And I'm going to introduce Professor Mariko Murata. She's professor of the Department of Sociology at Kansai University, University of Kansai in Japan, Osaka, and we met there in 2019 when there was a large meeting of ICU, the International Museum Council from UNESCO, gathering more than 4,000 people in Kyoto. What is very interesting in her research is that she approaches the museum as media, as an expert in media with a solid background in England by Goldsmith, and also masters in these two universities, in Goldsmith in London, England, and Tokyo University in Japan. Her initial background is in art history, which I find very interesting in Japan, and also a PhD at the University of Tokyo. So I'm very pleased. Jorge, the professor is having some difficulty with the equipment. And to help us to have this conversation, I'd also like to thank very much the presence of Ilana Goldstein, who's been for very long in the activities of the Permanent Forum, this research group that organizes along with the program this event. And Professor Ilana Selster Goldstein, she's a master in social anthropology at USP, master in cultural mediation by the University Paris III, PhD in social anthropology at Unicamp. Today, for some time, she's been a professor at the Department of Art History at the Federal University of São Paulo. She's also a curator, an art critic, very important as a culture critic. And she's also been working at the post-graduation at Unifesp and also in other institutions. And I'd also like to mention our simultaneous translator. It's always a very difficult task. Noemi Jaffe, we've also known each other for some time. She has a background also at this university, but she's one of the most well-known writers today in Brazil. Noemi, thank you very much for your participation at this moment, and I'm going to pass the floor to Professor Mariko Murata, so we can begin your talk. Thank you very much.
Muito obrigado. Hello, my name is Mariko, and thank you for having me today. It is really an honor to be here. And sorry, I need to see my paper on the mobile. But, yeah, so I am a professor of media and cultural studies at the Kansai University in Japan. I am currently a member of a fellow of a institute called IIAS, International Institute of Asian Studies in the Netherlands. And there I do research on decolonizing museums. Before I start my talk, I would like to thank the Institute of Advanced Studies of the University of São Paulo and its research group Forum Permanente, and Professor Martin Grossman, and to all the staffs who had made this happen. It is really, really special that I get a chance to talk and communicate with the people here in Brazil. So today, maybe I can go to my slide. Is it showing? Yeah, okay. So today, I'd like to talk about the museums related to the Indigenous Ainu in Japan and examine how the process of decolonization has sort of started, I could say. Yes. Yeah, I can see it over here. Yeah. So decolonization is something no museum in the world can ignore. And of course, this has not been the case until maybe 5 years ago. So rapidly, everything is happening. In museums in the Netherlands and the UK, where I mainly do research right now, decolonization mainly deals about the colonial past, such as the transatlantic slavery and the heritage of slavery related to the VOC, the Dutch East India Company. And decolonization is mainly about deconstructing colonial discourses or returning objects belonging to the community or provenance research. On the other hand, decolonization in museums in countries such as Australia, New Zealand, and the Americas mainly deal with the decolonization of the indigenous people and promoting their culture. Martin, I came here last week, and Martin took me to Musby the other day, and just from being there for several hours, it was clear to me that the museum was actively engaging in the issue of decolonization. And I was in Rio this weekend, and also at the MAR, it was the same. And so it was really, really interesting. And actually, before coming here, I was in the United States. I was in Denver, Colorado, for a conference on museums. And there, the keynote speaker was Greg Deal, who is an artist and an activist of the Paiute tribe. I also visited some museums there in Denver. And at the Museum of Nature and Science, they have put up a sign that announces that they would close down the whole of North American Indian because it harms them, right? And it's saying that by having them inside the glasses, it would assume that their culture is already not non-existent or extinct. So they said they would acknowledge it and they would change the exhibition. The Denver Art Museum was also having a lot of indigenous art, and the exhibition on the contemporary indigenous art was really, really interesting. Although I noticed that in the United States, they don't use the word decolonization. Yeah. I heard that here in Brazil, there are more than 896,000 indigenous people and about 300 ethnic groups. In Japan, while we have a population of 126 million people, the survey only counts 13,000 indigenous Ainu. That is like 0.01% or something, right? So, yeah. Okay, so who are the Ainu people? Well, they are indigenous people in the north of Japan, mainly the Hokkaido, and also a bit of the northern part of the mainland. And the culture is said to have formulated around the 12th century or a bit before. The Ainu culture expands further up north to Russia, as you can see on the map. We have the Sakhalin Ainu and the Krill Ainu, and also the Hokkaido Ainu. And there are also other ethnic groups, such as the Wilta and the Nibu. And they are not Ainu, but they share very similar cultures. But then in the 17th century, the mainland Japan went to Hokkaido and started reclaiming the land. So now the Ainu people were exploited. Before that, they were living through free trade with the surrounding people. But because the Matsumai clan monopolized that right, and took over, they couldn't trade anything on their own, and so the mainland Japan actually exploited them. And in the Meiji period, the next period to Edo, the government established the Kaitakushi, which is an agency for reclamation, and the land was renamed Hokkaido, the name we have now, in 1869. This was the beginning of the assimilation policy. I'm not going to go into detail, but the government tried to assimilate them into Japanese culture as much as possible. Slow down. Okay, sorry, yeah. And to make them Japanese. So they were, bit by bit, the assimilation policy went through. And after the World War II, the Ainu people were ignored as though they did not exist. And so the Ainu issue was long forgotten and the culture was almost extinct. And it was only in 2008 that the Japanese government recognized that the Ainu are the indigenous people of Japan. Is that slow enough? Okay. Sorry. Yeah, okay, I forgot to show this. But yeah. Okay, so as we can see, the Ainu people have been neglected and forgotten for a long time. However, just as Tokyo won the bid for the Olympic Paralympic Games for 2020, all of a sudden, Ainu culture was in the spotlight. And this is because the government wanted the Ainu culture to be the symbol of diversity in Japan. And as you know, since the London Olympics, diversity and inclusion became important in global politics and tourism. And so in 2020, the Upopoy National Ainu Museum in Park opened. And this is one of the main institutions to realize this policy of the government. And here I want to see how the Ainu culture has been represented until today and how Upopoy, as the first national museum specializing in Ainu culture, represents them. Here, and this is the... Of course, there existed small museums and exhibits before this. There are about 20 museums in Japan that exhibit the Ainu culture. And here there are two types of Ainu collections and museums. One is a collection and museums established by the Ainu themselves in order to preserve or for the sake of tourism. And two, the collections and museums that the researchers and collectors and traders or the government established. And this two type, please remember this two types because it's very important. It's directly connected to the issue that I will talk about concerning the Upopoy Ainu exhibit. So talking about the second type. Sorry, I lost track. Okay, sorry. Yeah, so this is the second type. And as you know, the Ainu people were collected, exhibited, and othered in world expos and industrial exhibitions during the 19th to 20th century. Could you do me a favor? Could you, yeah, because this is why I don't have three hands, so thank you. Yes, yeah, so the next slide, please. So this is, this one's proceed, yeah. Thank you, yeah. And at the same time, the first type, the Ainu themselves made museums in order to preserve their culture on their own. And I'll just show you some famous ones. This is said to be the oldest private museum of Ainu in Hokkaido. It was made by Kawamura Kaneto, a chief of the Kamikawa Ainu and surveying engineer for the Japanese National Railway. He made it when the Imperial Japanese Army, the 7th Division, came to Asahikawa City to station there. And so the Ainu people had to mix with the mainland Japanese. And they felt they were gazed and felt very misunderstood. So he decided to build a museum. And it was Kaneto's grandson, who was the third director, that he passed away in 2021. And right now, his wife is in charge, but his son, Kaneto's son, will soon be the new director. And they are building a new building next to this original one, and it will open this summer. So let's see what happens. And next, please. Oh yeah, there's another picture of the museum. The next one, please. Yeah, and of course, the Ainu were engaged in tourism to make money and to make a living. This is the Akanko, which is a famous Ainu tourism spot. Next slide, please. This is the Kaya no Shigeru Nibutani Ainu Museum, which opened in 1972. And this Kayano is a very interesting guy, and he was very smart, and he became the first Ainu member of the Diet. I think one and only. And 5 years later, after he opened the museum, in 1977, he gave the land, the building, and the objects to the town of Biratori free of charge, which meant now that the Biratori city had to take care of the museum. Next slide, please. So in 1991, a new museum was made near the Nibutani Dam. And this was like a negotiation, because where they built the dam, it was the land of the Ainu. So they sort of, yeah. So instead of having the dam, they made a new museum. But the old museum that I just showed you before is also still open with less objects. Next slide, please. Yeah, so this is the picture of the dam, and you see right next to the dam there, they made a little village with the museum and the chisei, the Ainu houses, and the souvenir shop, etc. Yeah. Next one, please. Oh, well, anyway, as I said, it was built on the sacred land of Ainu. Sorry, going back. Yeah. So as I said, it was built on the sacred land of Ainu. So they had Kayano sued the government, actually, and he lost. But then in the end, it was good, because that was the time when it was a landmark decision to say that the court said that it disregarded the Ainu culture for the first time. So yeah, they sort of recognized that legally that Japan was not a single nation, and that the indigenous people were there before us. Okay, now going to the, this is the museum that is very important, because this is the former original museum of the Upopoy. It is the Shiratori Porotokotan Ainu Museum, and it's a museum in Ainu village park with a lake. Porotokotan means a village or a community at the big lake. And the park opened in 1965 and the museum in 1984. And it was run by a foundation. And the museum was handmade and by the residents of the Ainu roots. And they sort of run the museum, performed, and preserved the Ainu culture. Next slide, please. So, for example, they would show dances and ceremonies. And after that, they would sell souvenirs with their own hands. Next slide, please. And so as I've mentioned, it was this site that was upgraded to the National Museum. And this is the National Museum here. This building is quite new. Oh, yeah. It opened in 2020 with the aim of promoting the culture of Ainu. They had this museum, the Ainu village, and theaters and learning centers. And this, the one on the slide right now, is a memorial site. This holds the remains of the Ainu, and the remains were, between parentheses, repatriated here from universities, because researchers collected them. And a lot of them cannot be identified anymore. I'm not going to go into details, but this is a very controversial issue, as you can imagine. Next slide, please. And next one, please. Yeah, so this is the, going back to the Upopoy side, they have succeeded many of the facilities that the Porotokotan used. You can see how the facility was, is very similar to what it was in before. The next one, please. So I put two pictures, the one in Porotokota and the one Upopoy. On the left, so the roofs are rethatched and the wall is remade, and it's a bit more in shape, I guess. The next one, please. And the inside as well. The left one is the original one with the salmons dangling, and the right one is the refurbished one. For me, it has a little bit lost the touch, but I don't know. Yeah. Next one, please. So this is the new Upopoy Museum. Next one. And when you enter the entrance, there's a digital signage on the wall, and the Ainu people will appear both in their traditional clothes and the daily clothes. Next one, please. Yeah, like this. The next one, please. Yeah, and then they show you to enter the museum. Next one, please. So this is the new museum. Next one, please. Yes, and I'll show you some of the objects. This garment was made in 2010 by Shimako Yamazaki, and it is a reproduction of the original collection. And the inner garment, which you see in the color, was made in 2020 by Chiho Shirosaki. So you can see that they are very new. And also you can see that the names of the individual are shown on the panel as well, which is very important. Next one, please. This garment also is a reproduction of the original in Hokkaido Museum, and it was reproduced in 2011 by Sachiko Yoshida. Next one, please. This one, you can see the outfit is a bit different. It is from the Sakhalin, and this is by Hatsuko Ogawa in 1987, and this belongs to Hokkaido Museum of Northern People. So this is a garment of Wilta. Yeah, thank you. And this makiri was made in 2014 by Tahachi Urakawa. So you see all the names of the people the craftsmen and people who made it. Next one, please. So this is the old museum in Porotokota. So this was how it was exhibited. And the figures also, this was done by the Ainu people themselves. Next one, please. And this, we go back to the Kawamura Kaneto Ainu Museum again. You see how the clothes and the objects are exhibited in a nice and traditional way, yeah. And this one is the new Upopoy. On the left is the Inau, that's a sacred object for the Ainu people, which intermediates the god, the Kamui, and the people. And on the right, you have the swords because of the communication between the mainland Japanese. Next one, please. Yeah, this is also Upopoy in glass cases. Next one, please. Again, we go back to the Kayano Shigeru Ainu Museum, and we see how different the exhibit is. The next one. Yes, and the next one, please. And this is the Biratori Municipal Museum, and then the one next to the dam as well. So it really, it's really different how you exhibit it. Yeah. Next one, please. Okay. Now this, we go back to Upopoy again. This is a fireplace, actually. And so you have two benches, and one, you can see a digital image of a fire. Next one, please. Yeah, so, and this lady will talk about the folkloric Ainu story. Next one, please. Yeah, and this was, again, the Kawamura Kaneto Ainu Museum, and you can see the fireplace in the middle of the house. So this was the original one, and they sort of made it as a digital signage. Yeah, and next one, please. This is the Biratori Municipal Museum. So this is, you can see that this fireplace is very symbolic of the Ainu culture, and where the elderly will tell stories to the kids at the fire. Okay, next one, please. Yeah, next one, please. So the Upopoy shows the Ainu people as they are today, right? Trying to show that they are people that live now, and that lives, fishermen, forestry workers, farmers, fair traders, cooks, etc., etc. And if you look at the panel from the backside, next slide, please. You have all the explanations and the videos, and this should be like an answer to the tourists asking questions like, do you still hunt in the woods? Or, oh, you speak excellent Japanese, these sort of stereotypes. It answers to that. Okay, the next one, please. But I think what the most interesting and controversial is their panel, the narrative. For example, this it has 5 languages, Ainu, showing very different dialects, because Ainu is unwritten. It's shown in Japanese letters, but it's Ainu, and Japanese, English, Chinese, and Korean. And next one, please. And the thing is, they use the subject we, meaning they would talk about the museum using we are, or, our culture. Next one, please. Yeah, this one also says our language. So the use of we in the panel. Yeah, and the we perhaps is a result of their research, the museum's research and survey, because, for example, in Smithsonian National Museums, they started using the word we when they opened in 2004. So our lives and we are, this way of talking. And they also have performances by Native Americans, and so there's a lot of similarities with the Upopoy. The next slide. And in Denver, where I was 2 weeks ago, the Colorado History Center has a exhibition on the tribe. In the States, they still call it tribes, okay? And the tribes. And they represent the exhibit by using we. And this shows their ongoing relationship for 20 years with the Utah tribe living there, because it's the Denver is their land, actually. And but my impression is that using we as a subject for exhibition is very difficult, because it cannot explain everything, the backgrounds and the relationship with the colonized and colonizers, and within it has to talk about the community as well. So using we is a challenge, and it's very difficult, I think. Yes. And so Upopoy is using this difficult we, but the problem lay in the narrative. So could you go back to several? Yeah, just leave it there, yes. And in Japanese, it is even more difficult, because we don't necessarily have to have the subject in a sentence. But then when you read it, sometimes this we pops up, and it's really awkward in a sense. But the real issue is this. I mentioned there are 2 types of Ainu-related museums. One is the one established by the Ainu themselves, and the other is the one by the collectors. And the difficulty is with Upopoy is that Upopoy was a museum that was upgraded from an Ainu museum that the Ainu made to a national museum. And now there is already a contradiction. And when they upgraded into Upopoy, they hired all the people of Porotokotan, which were 70% of them were Ainu. So now, who are the we? So so from which standpoint should the museum talk? So should it be a standpoint of the National Museum? Then it would be like the colonizer we. If we talk about the Ainu side, from the Ainu point of view, the Ainu we. So this contradiction has not been solved, and it's there. And that is why it's very, very difficult. Okay, thank you. So wrapping up, we have seen a lot of the new type of exhibits that the Upopoy was trying to do. For example, 1, avoiding representing Ainu culture as a pre-modern and uncivilized people. 2, showing that the Ainu people is present. It's in their present tense, their careers. They use high usage of digital image. And this means they can change the exhibits really easily, so they can react to the response that they get. And they are also constantly making small changes in the exhibition. But the narrative of we, as I told you, is unsolved. Okay, next one, please. So when the museum opened, there was a strong criticism towards the museum. For example, Nodoka Odawara says, when we speak of Ainu culture as a valuable part of Japanese culture that is in danger of extinction, who exactly is responsible for this extinction? Isn't it the role of national center to clearly state the responsibility from the viewpoint of we, the Japanese, rather than having we, the Ainu people, explain this? Otherwise, the exhibition is nothing more than another assimilation. So her comment is very strong. The next one. And I have a friend who's a curator of Upopoy, and he collected comments that was referred to the museum. And one says, the museum's display neglects or ignores the fact that the Ainu people have suffered a tragic history spanning 150 years. I was continuously shocked by the explanatory texts in the history exhibit. Another one, the problem is that, the problem is that Ainu culture is explained from a Japanese point of view, which lack historical awareness of the Ainu. The initiative to grasp the spirituality of the Ainu people. Next one, please. And this researcher says, the structure of the permanent exhibits give the impression that history is being neglected. I also have the impression that being a national museum, there must be a restriction on the content of the history exhibits. Ironically, the Ainu point of view hinders the negative history to the point where we even suspect that it was a concealment. Next one, please. So there are very strong comments. But, you know, despite its strong comments, I think, oops, the one behind. Yeah, I'll end here. Despite the strong comments, I think it's important that it opened up the forum in a sense. And I think this has never happened in a museum in Japan. So despite all the issues, I think it's a starting point. And Upopoy and other museums can and should become the site of thinking about this topic in Japan, where it is, quote unquote, a homogenized country. I will leave it there. And I know I couldn't finish everything, but maybe I could add when answering some questions. But so decolonizing museums in Japan is also becoming a hot topic now. Thank you.
I'd like to say that I thought a lot about your speech. I think you're going to have some time at the end. If you find it interesting to tell, we keep asking ourselves, where is the protagonism of the Ainu in this new museum? Because as I understood, it is being managed by the state, and there are 70% of the people who work there are Ainu. So what kind of space of agency do they have there? To which extent can they influence in how their texts, what to expose, what not to say? So if there's a space for the agency of the Ainu themselves. So this is the first thing that it's worthwhile for you to develop a little more in our final conversation. And another question, which I find very important, is to which extent this museum can also serve as a place of learning for the very indigenous people. So it ends up being much more a postcard, a tourist attraction, or is it also simultaneously, does it also have this role of conveying knowledge to the new generations? Now I'm going to pass the floor to the presentation of our next guest. It's a joy for us to have him here. I'm going to speak very quickly because we have only a short time. Suzenalson da Silva Santos. He has a very rich experience, but for an issue of time, I'm going to talk only about a few elements, as I have to do with the other guests as well. Suzenalson has a degree in Indigenous Interculture, a master's in humanities by the University of Lusófonos Afro-Brazilian University, Unilab, and he has a PhD in social history by the University of Ceará. Today, he coordinates the Indigenous Museum Canindé of Aratuba, which is in Ceará. This is the second Indigenous museum in Brazil in the year of 1996. The first museum, Marico, is called Maguta, It's of the people Ticuna. Started in the 80s. It's a series of museums that have been inaugurated. I was saying that Susan Alton, I'm sorry, he's the coordinator today of the Indigenous Museum Canindé de Aratuba. That was the second Indigenous museum inaugurated in Brazil in 1996. I'd like to ask Susan Alson, if possible, in your talk, to comment how did the museum impact schooling education and how the school impacts the museum. Reading about your museum, it seemed to me that it's very important that this relationship, school and museum, is very important. Education and culture interconnected. Another aspect that would be interesting, if you could comment a little, is the relationship that you have developed with other community museums. For example, the Quilombo Museum in the Serra do Evaristo. It seems to me that you belong to a network of community museums and how this network works and this relationship with other institutions. The last issue, I don't know if you have time to it, if it's interesting for you to approach, if you've ever thought of developing ethnical tourism. I thought about this because according to Marico's exhibition, it's clear to us that this museum also has a tourist character. So if this would make sense in your museum, if you ever thought about it. Thank you, we were anxious to listening to you. So I pass the floor to Susan Alson. One little thing. When there are 2 minutes left to finish the 15 minutes, I will show a sign, or would you rather, what do you prefer, Susan Alson? Anything. Good morning, everyone. Everybody who is here in this moment. It's a joy to contribute with this moment of discussion that is so interesting to us. And we're very happy to discuss with other people in other issues in such a collective way. I'd like to thank the invitation to the Museum of the Canindé, and I'd like to extend the invitation to all the indigenous people in the state of Ceará to bring this experience. I'd like to begin my talk, dear teachers, once we're speaking about decolonization of the wisdom, of memory, of the culture itself, by stating the situation in which indigenous people are living today in Brazil. We're living a very difficult moment again. Our rights are being attacked straightforwardly with the new law that was decreed. And I'd like to state in my talk that I repudiate the actions that the National Congress is taking, and it's attacking the indigenous cultures here in Brazil. We've been fighting and resisting for more than 520 years in this territory. This territory, such as the Japanese territory, is our land. It's the indigenous and sacred land where it has meaning. And for us, indigenous people, these are ways for us to think and discuss. We also need your support. You are our friends, our collaborators, militating in this fight that we've been working collectively. So first of all, I'd like to state my sadness for the conquests we've had and lost. So Brazil, despite its cultural language and people's diversity in so many cultures, it still insists in forgetting all this process of memory and creation and the background of our humanity and life in the state of Brazil. I'd like to greet Professor Mariko's talk, say that it's a pleasure for me to know her, even if it's virtual. I'd like you to take our fight and our embrace to all the indigenous people, from all the indigenous people in Brazil to our relatives in Japan, the Ainu people, and say that our fight is collective. It's a fight that conveys a meaning and a way of creation, what we build every day. I am Canindé, I am indigenous. Many people consider myself inside this stereotype of having a visible profile. Many people call me Japanese. Maybe I've come from a Japanese descendant, the Ainu people. Our visibility appears inside a collective group. Maybe that's why so many of our talks, of our leaderships are interconnected, everything we've built every day. I speak from the village Sítio Fernandes in the state of Ceará, in the northeast of the country. Our village is 140 kilometers away from the capital, Fortaleza. And the experience I've brought to contribute with the discussion of the professor and the other people who are here in our conversation is that an experience created through an appropriation of the indigenous people, especially the people Canindé, through an object or a colonizing form, has always shown our history in a museum. And throughout these years, we, the indigenous people, not only here from Ceará, but in the whole country, our relative Suzilene will give the example of the Caingangue Museum, which is also very interesting, created by two indigenous women. And here in the state of Ceará, in the decade of the 90s, after our movement of and the populations have started creating their spaces, they're called museums. The so-called indigenous museums, where I intend to get in the end of my talk. Professor also spoke about the polemical subjects. In 1995, our chief, the Master Sotero, the master of the culture, who is recognized as a live treasure in Ceará by the government of the state and by the universities, he creates a small site, a small space here in our village where, right in the beginning, he said it was supposed to show the history of the Indian in society, our own history, our life. And so from this construction, many other stages of the process start, and they lead to many other actions. The museum created by Sotero are the things that exist in the community, in the village, and in the territory. And this relationship is very strong was very strong when we began our process of affirmation. We didn't have schools. We were one of the peoples to conquer school very late inside the community. Only in 2006, And the museum was created in this perspective of relationship with the schools. So what Sotero was creating, the animals, the things from the forest, the sacred objects, the craftsmen of our background, it brings it inside a context of relationship with the process that is being called in the universities decolonization, other perspectives, other ways of thinking as well. This indigenous movement that happens inside the villages, especially in the Canindé people from which I'm speaking. And this experience has brought a lot of background because it comprises many generations. Since the master Cacique Sotero, who created the museum in 1995, it's been going through many other generations that are the younger generations, young people from the village who are formed according to this perspective of education, culture, and the very life with the master Sotero here in the village. And these actions are very related to the aspect of schooling education and indigenous education. The museum is located right next to the school. So the museum is part of the curriculum of the school where the teachers work in all the areas of knowledge and action that in the very curriculum of the school, and these generations also have been transformed in an education nucleus of the museum, the people who work and organize, along with Sotero, this relationship, this curriculum, facing the issue of the museum and the school. These relationships, they have grown a lot, not only for the indigenous people, but beyond them. Also, the issue of the indigenous network that was created in 2014 with many indigenous communities, all the Brazilian states. Today, we have a large network of memory and indigenous and social museology in all of the Brazilian territory, from the Northeast, São Paulo, the South region, the North region. All these spaces today exist. There are also spaces that we call indigenous museums. Other populations also give other names as memory house, point of memory, point of culture. And so this whole network, they have grown around these memories. And today, only here in the state of Ceará, where we have this network of the state, many comprising the country, 17 or 18 initiatives, and it spreads to the other states. In the last forum, we managed to fulfill 32 initiatives from the whole country that participated in the forums. The forums are another conquest that we've had in this process of organizing the indigenous people in the Brazilian country. Everything organized autonomously, also with partnerships that we have with other networks, other modes of information and communication in the context of the city and the indigenous people. For example, the universities are also participating. They're very interested in this background. And this relationship has grown a lot. And many other meetings as well, not only with the network, but with the indigenous museums that have contextualized in this background. And some experiences that we've had, she asked if there is a project of ethnical tourism. Some of these populations and these museums also work with experiences. Maybe they cannot be called ethnical tourism. I don't know the terminology that you decided to use, if these are the stages among the people themselves, but some experiences, they work with community tourism. It's a basic tourism where all these actions of the territory within their villages work, and the very background of how this social construction works, of these memories of these indigenous people and their very background and their social context of the network that comprises these museums. They are part of other memory networks, and also the social construction of the context of memories that try to speak about the organization that happens in these indigenous societies all through the country in Brazil. Well, these experiences, they're interesting for us to understand. Why? Because very commonly we hear within our leaderships, the guardians of memory, that there was a time, a very distant past, when it was forbidden to speak about the indigenous history within the territories, or even say that we were Indians. We hear the word Indian by the old people. This word is being discussed in the university. And so this silence that happened here in the Northeast, it happened also in many other places, that people couldn't say they were Indians, indigenous, because I speak according to the stories my father tells, the Cacique Sotero. He always says that he couldn't say he was an Indian, because if he said so, he would be killed by a white man. And this story begins to be created according to many other formations of the very process of affirming the indigenous people. And that's why these museums started. They are a tool not only of self-affirmation, but also as a tool for an organizational movement of the very social construction of memories and the construction of the identity among these indigenous people. I'd say that to build these memories has been very difficult, as it has been in Japan. But there are many initiatives here in Brazil that are very interesting for you to know. Since the territory, the villages themselves, the sacred places, the memory places, memory sites, memory houses, and other territories as well, they bring and can bring to surface this fight for the territory, the demarcation of our territories here in Brazil, that despite all our conquests is still a very big challenge, this issue of the indigenous land in Brazil. I'm finishing. And these processes, they're dynamized according to the cosmology that we have in each people, in each village, each process that happens. And that's why it also brings a relationship of sociability within the conditions of social construction and the memories that happen in these populations. Well, that's a little of what I'd like to bring to you. I'd like to leave a question to Professor Mariko. What's this relationship of the Ainu people with the land, if it's like in Brazil, the processes of marking the land? And now I pass the floor to my relative, Suzilene, in São Paulo. We know through the Indigenous Network, they have a very interesting and strong process in the west of São Paulo. I'd like to leave you my regards to Dona Dirce, who is a leader of your people, I'm very grateful, and afterwards, if there's a question, I'm willing to answer it. Thank you, everyone. I'd like to thank Susan Alson. We have the dimension, the connection between the Indigenous Museum and the territory. This relation is very clear. The organization of this panel is solidarious with your fight against the temporal mark, this absurd law. And now I pass the floor to the next guest, Suzilene Caingangue, Suzilene Elias de Mello. She was born in the village Indiavanuiri, near the city of Tupã in the state of São Paulo. She is a craftswoman, also an assistant of the leader Pajé, and she leads a cultural group Caingangue in the indigenous land Indiapanui. Suzilene is one of the curators of an exhibition here at USP in the Archaeology and Ethnology Museum, MAI. This exhibition is called Resistance Now, Strengthening and Uniting the Indigenous Cultures. It has participations of the indigenous people in São Paulo, the Caingangue, the Guarani, and the Terena. Along with other women, powerful women in her family, Suzilene idealized the Voice Museum that she will introduce to us today. She did a course that is called Museology for Indigenous People in 2017. She participates annually in the Paulista Meeting for Indigenous Issues and Museums, and she's also present in many other events in the area of social and indigenous museology. Two elements that I'd like to ask Suzilene to take into account, if it's possible, throughout her talk, is the relationship of the museum Voriki with the museum Indiavanuiri that belongs to the government of the state of São Paulo, and that is in the city of Tupã, near the indigenous land. Are there relationships of partnership between these two museums, Suzilene, or is there a competition, or do they act simultaneously or independently? I think that's interesting for us to think also of the Vainu affair. It is directed by the very indigenous people, and the other one who is connected to the structure of the state. And the second question that I feel in some of your talks is the relationship between the material and immaterial dimension, as if objects and images in an indigenous museum were much more than what we that are non-indigenous see. How do you deal with it? We're speaking of an immaterial, ancestral, and spiritual dimension, but you only show images and objects. So I pass the floor to you when there are 2 minutes missing for the end. Unfortunately, I'll have to tell you. Good morning, everyone. I'd like to ask your permission and also thank for your invitation. Hello, my relative, I miss you a lot. I'd like to embrace you. I will begin saying that our work, our activities, the ones we do in the museum, it was born in 2015. Can everybody hear me? It was born in 2015, but it was only in paper. So in 2016, my grandmother died. And we felt the need to do everything according to her wishes, to erect a museum. And so in 2017, we created the first exhibition of the museum with all the collection of my grandmother. My grandmother, her name is Jandiron Belino. The Caingangue people, I'm also Caingangue. And I'm the assistant of my mother, who is Dirce Jorge Caingangue. So actually, I began very early as an assistant. So I learned many things with my grandmother. I was her assistant. All the part of culture and rituals and songs and dances and food, nourishment, and garments, everything I learned with my mother and grandmother. I lost my grandmother 6 years ago, and I am trying to continue the work with culture and the museum along with my mother. So I say that it's a museum. It's not a state museum. We don't have much help. Everything we do here, we take a little from here, a little from there, and we put it inside the museum. It's a different museum. It has a Caingangue profile. The exhibition is also different. It also looks Caingangue. Even to protect our territory. Our culture was asleep for some time. And now for 26 years, we've been trying to do this work of showing our culture, of dancing, trying to speak about our culture wherever you go. We receive the visitors here. The museum is open the whole year. We only don't open it on weekends because we need a little rest. So usually we receive the schools 3 to 4 times a week. Everything is done through the internet, and the activities we've been doing in the museum in the city of Tupã, they are partnerships. So we are invited to do activities in the city. Tomorrow I'm going to the Museum Índia Vanuiri to do an activity of musical instruments of our culture. I don't have much to speak or complain about the museum. If today we speak about museums, if today we introduce our museum, it was because my mother started the Índia Vanuiri Museum. When everything started right in the beginning, more than 20 years ago, my mother was curious to know why non-Indigenous spoke so much about the Indigenous. They spoke so much about us, about our territory and other territories as well. And out of curiosity, she started to understand more about exhibitions and museums and why people spoke so much about us. And so out of this curiosity, the museum was born of a Caingangue that peopled our territory. I'm the 5th generation of Avorici. So I'm very proud to say that I belong to the 5th generation. And here, for us, not only the partnership with the Índia Vanuiri Museum, but also we have a partnership with the My Museum, where the resistance now strengthening and union of cultures is being shown at USP. When we started to work in this exhibition, it was all very planned. It's like a baby. We started working little by little, and then we got to know the collection, and from the collection we chose which objects would be exhibited. We also created some objects to show to the people from our territory how our work is made, how our garments are produced. This is very important, not only the past garments, but also the garments of dancing and also the instruments, which is very important. So we have these partnerships. And also we have some partners that are very important. Our fight, the fight of the indigenous people, we need to have our partners, the non-indigenous partners along with us. This is the temporal mark, this law that is being passed in the Congress. He talked about that it's very sad. So much is happening, even until we have our territory marked. We're very concerned with our relatives. So these are days of fight. It's not that every day is a day of fighting, and we're concerned with everything that is happening in our country. But the other countries, I ask them to embrace our cause, because our land, no matter if it's inside Brazil or not, it is indigenous land. So there are other indigenous people outside Brazil, and we also see our concern here is also with the praying houses. Today, we speak so little about the indigenous people that are being attacked and massacred. They're throwing fire at the praying houses. They have no respect for the children, for the pajés. This is a massacre. It's a real strong massacre. And once again, we're here in this fight, but also resisting inside our territory, because we have to be inside it, taking care, singing, doing our rituals and strengthening ourselves. And here inside our museum, I'd like to tell you that a museum is not only material, what is here in front of me, but the spiritual part. It's a museum of cure, healing, searching, strengthening, that strengthens us. Here, when people get here, they get with an idea that they're going to see a museum like a museum in the city. It's not that. The museum, for me, many of the relatives shared with us from other states. As he said, the museum is part of the territory. It's everything we live. So I am the museum. My mother is a museum, and she brings her museum to other museums. That's very important for us, indigenous peoples. For my culture of the Caingangue people, many times we see a non-indigenous saying that Caingangue in the state of São Paulo is extinct, that we were extinguished. But I'm here, my mother is also here. I'm her assistant, and we're here very strong and steady to say that we resist. We are inside the state of São Paulo. We are in the west of the state. We are a live museum. We are a museum that walks, and we take our museum inside other museums. Our museum here is where many of the people get here looking for an idea that they're going to find a lot of glass.
Museu assim da cidade, mas não é.
A museum of the city, but it's different. It has a different exhibition. It's a museum where we light the fire inside the museum, and many people get scared. It's a way of us to work. We do the dancing, the singing. We walk in the trail. We're building a house to leave our exhibition. So here, to the people who don't know it, to follow us on Instagram, Devoriki, and our work is there, the work we do the whole year. And I'll leave here for people who have a question. If you have some time, I'm here to answer. Thank you. Thank you. Amazing talk. Congratulations for the female protagonism of the women, Kaingangi. This last dimension that you spoke about, the invisible part of the museum, I think it's a common point to many indigenous museums that I have seen. I don't know if you know, but the Auxá people from the Xingu, they want to create a museum as well, that they're not going to have headquarters. They want some of their practices to be the museum. They're going to choose part of their knowledge, part of their stories. It's going to become part of the collection that is going to be immaterial. So now they're thinking of how they can convey it, how they can record it. But I heard Waushi Autaki from Xingu speaking about this idea of a museum, and it's going to be within this dimension of a museum that gives priority to the immaterial knowledge. I'm very interested. I don't know if Professor Marico, if you've seen, but here in São Paulo, in less than a year ago, the Museum of the Indigenous Culture was inaugurated. Were you there? Oh, you were there. They also have the proposition, they have 7 floors, but when I asked them, are you going to have a collection? A material collection, they said, no, it's not our concern right now. We have indigenous here inside it. We receive the non-indigenous, we talk to them, we get next close to each other. We have some temporary exhibitions, but our goal now is not to have a collection of material things. We have something to learn with this other way of creating indigenous museums. Now, the talks are very stimulating. We're going to have a short pause. Não precisa, não precisa.
Ela está dizendo que não. Eu acho que
não. Tá ok. Pode ir.
Ela está falando que não. Bom, então estamos dizendo que ela que manda. Tá bom, então a gente já e eu vou apresentar.
I'm going to introduce our next guest, Sandra Mara Salles, who is a master in social anthropology and ethnology by École de Haute Étude Musée Social in France. And she has a PhD in art history by the University of Campinas, Unicamp. She has dedicated herself to the research of artistic modernities in Africa, history of African exhibitions, and international circulation of artists in the African continent. She works in the Afro-Brazilian Museum since 2010 in different sectors and positions. Today, she has assumed the position of executive director of the museum. And I'd like to ask 2 questions, Sandra, if it's possible for you to talk about them in your speech. The other presentations that we saw here emphasize the role of building identity of the communitary museums, speaking about the territory very strongly. In the Afro-Brazil Museum, the situation is a little different because it is inside a park, the biggest in São Paulo, and it does not belong or it does not represent a single ethnical group, a segment of the population, of course, but from many different ethnical origins. You said in one interview in 2014 that Emanuel Araújo, the artist and collector of Afro-Brazilian objects that created the museum, that he didn't understand the museum as anthropological. He didn't want this institution to talk only with Black people. What Emmanuel Araújo intended was to tell some stories that were erased in the official narrative of the country. And he wanted the Afro-Brazilian Museum to have a dialogue with all the citizens, not only a ghetto museum. I think these are his words. I'd like to ask you if you can approach this 10 years later. This institutional position, does it continue? What is the relationship between the Black movements with the Afro-Brazilian movement, and which role does this movement have for the Black activism? I'm making these questions so we can create some parallels with the other presentations that were made here. And my second question, if it's possible for you to talk about, to which extent are there practices in the Afro-Brazilian Museum that also deserve to be decolonized? These debates about decolonization, are they having a repercussion in your museum? Because in principle, the creator of your museum was an Afro-Brazilian. The collection is all of Afro-Brazilian pieces, but still I imagine there are some practices that are colonized. So if you can talk in your specific case, how are you dealing with this debate? So I pass the floor to you. I'm very happy to see you again. I'm very happy to. Almost good afternoon, good morning. Good morning, everyone. It's an honor for me to be here with you in your company. I'm very happy. I'm feeling very privileged. Susan Alson, we've tried to bring you to the museum. The first time it didn't work, but we haven't lost hope. We'll manage to do it soon. And I hope Suzilene also comes. We have a very close relationship with your museum. It's also a state museum. So I believe we have we can have good partnerships to develop in the future. And in your questions, do I have 2 hours for us to talk? Because it's a lot of things. So I'm going to introduce myself only to personalize the situation in the museum today. I think this is important. Today, I occupy the executive direction of the Afro-Brazilian Museum. We're in the moment, we don't have a technical or artistic direction, a curator. As Ilana said, it was founded by a man, Emmanuel Araújo. Emmanuel Araújo was an artist, a sculptor, curator, museum director. He was the municipal secretary of culture, a big collector. So now today the museum is called Emmanuel Araújo. It has the name of its founder in the end of November. They changed the name of the museum, incorporating the name of its founder because he had recently died. Emmanuel Araújo died at 81 on the day 7th of September in 22. So this museum is now in this phase of transition. There are many changes being made from the point of view of the management, so we can hire and choose a new director that is also being defined as cultural or artistic director. Emmanuel was a director and a curator. And why am I speaking about Emmanuel, and why am I mentioning this phase of transition? Because Ilana spoke about one of my talks in 2014. It was based on the words of Emmanuel, and now the museum is going through a transformation. The museum is in Parque Ibirapuera. Can I share a PowerPoint? I don't know if everyone knows the museum. if Professor Mariko managed to visit the museum. I don't know if she managed to go or not.
Ela foi sim, Sandra.
She did.
Ela foi em tudo.
She went everywhere.
Excelente guia.
Martin is an excellent guide. What an odyssey. Can you see the screen? So for those who don't know the museum, it is in Parque Ibirapuera, the biggest park in South America. This is the location of the museum, and here I have an image of the facade. So it has almost 12,000 square meters right in the very center of the city. A very privileged neighborhood.
Isso, então aqui está o Parque Ibirapuera.
Here is the park, Ibirapuera. Here, an arrow shows where the museum is. A very big pavilion. We're doing a renovation now.
Da formação da coleção é importante.
And the background of the collection, because in this phase, there's a new reflection being made about the collection of the museum and the ways of exhibiting its cultural program. The museum was formed through an initial collection of Emmanuel, to which other donations were incorporated throughout the years. Emmanuel was the director of the museum for 18 years. I'm showing the images. Here is an image of the collection, the entrance of the museum. Here we have some images. Emmanuel made a donation. Emmanuel was a great collector. For more than 30 years, he had collected works of art, artifacts, everyday objects, furniture, photographs, artistic photographs, a series of items that he collected throughout the years, and he began the formation of the museum in 2004. So he remained as the director for 18 years. The museum approaches different aspects of the cultural universe in its many layers and spheres. It has a central axis that talks about religion, a big collection of African art, different African peoples. We have this multimedia facility that talks about this moment of passage from Africa to Brazil. Here, working objects of the people who were enslaved and brought to Brazil. Here's some images here too. We have this issue of the furniture and the life in the farms, in the different economic cycles. So I'm not going to talk about everything. I'm only showing some images, the orishas, again, the religious syncretism, some images by Pierre Verger of these African root manifestations in Brazil and its permanence, orishas, tools, cult objects that became artistic objects later on. They were recategorized. The issue of popular Catholicism, the festivities, the popular festivities of different periods in Brazilian history and different origins as well. It's a collection, it's a very diverse collection and with different provenances, but it starts most and foremost by a collection of Emmanuel. Now I'm going to talk about this nucleus. Maybe it can relate to the question that Ilana posed and the Black movements. Here we have a sculpture of a zumbi. One of the works exhibited in this nucleus called History and Memory. It's a kind of biographical gallery. One of the main narratives in the museum to show who was Black, who is Black in the Brazilian history, to make visible who was made invisible by the official history. This is not in other spaces of the museum, but with the images of the faces of these different nationalities and areas of the arts and culture and knowledge. They are more visible in this gallery. Here we have several other images, but I'd like to get this first moment to come back to these two questions raised by Ilana. The fact that the museum was created by a man who was the director of this place for 18 years, on the one hand, we can understand the museum. In my personal point of view, the Afro-Brazilian Museum, it was decolonized in its very construction, in its very proposition, in its narrative, in the construction of its collection, in the perspective it shows about the national history. So the issue of the contributions of the Africans and the Afro-descendants in the history, culture, and science in Brazil and in the world, it is not reserved to annexes within the curatorial narrative to a temporary exhibition. It is the kernel of the collection. It's a museum that talks about this history that was the non-official story for a long time. It was created in 2004 in a moment that it was practically the only place where we spoke about a great cultural space in the city of São Paulo that brought this proposition in such a visible form. Emmanuel had this thing of monumentalizing. He demanded that this museum be created in the center of the city. He wanted the modernist pavilion in the Ibirapuera Park because he said this story must be seen, this collection must be known, it has to be in the center of the city, occupying 12,000 square meters. So it is born this way. It is born putting this story out of the margins and putting it in the center of the city, in the center of the narrative. And so it's different intersections without our program, the background. We had a law that was created in 2003. The law that demands the teaching of the history of Africa and the Afro-Brazilian culture in the curriculum of the schools, of our schools. The museum has become a great center of formation of teachers, researchers, according to the law and its content. So from the beginning, it was a space of exhibition and formation and discussion that responds to an agenda that started to appear in this period. There were very few places where this agenda could really become effective. Now we're talking about a museum that had throughout its 18 years only one single curator. Emmanuel Araújo was the curator of, I'd risk to say, more than 90% of the temporary exhibitions that happened in the museum. They're suggesting so we can see you. We'd like to see you. But Emmanuel was the only curator of the museum throughout this whole time, practically, with very few exceptions. Sometimes he called associate curators. Even the very team of the museum didn't act as an assistant of curatorship or associated curator. So this monologue, we could say, even if it represented many voices, it continued being the narrative of a single man. So this is something that has started changing lately. But as a decolonizing practice, I believe this is one to which the museum is facing right now. It has searched, even when Emmanuel was still alive. That's a process that he began a little after the pandemics to open more spaces in the museum so other voices are heard. There are other processes of shared curatorship. So now I'd like to mention that we have an exhibition that is happening of Andrei Guaianazzi Ignato. He's an indigenous artist. He identifies himself as an indigenous artist. The name of the exhibition is Foundation, and he is the very curator of his exhibition. So maybe this is the first time that this is being done and announced. So the museum opened its space for the artist to show his work without the mediation of a curator. This is a process that is happening right now. From last year, the museum also aiming at widening its spheres of dialogue and participation. It's been trying to build a network. Now we opened a call for a network of Afro-Brazilian collections so people can start getting connected to these other spaces or institutions or even private collections that can also introduce other looks about the collection of the museum that has this very personal and personalized trace of individual construction of a great collector. The other process that the museum began in 2018, it was interrupted during the pandemics, and now it's being resumed, is the dialogue with the Quilombo São Pedro in the Vale do Ribeira. The museum is acting along with them of a technical support to think of a territory museum, as Susan also said, a center of memory or a cultural center. This is being discussed, but a house of memory, these are terms that are being discussed throughout these meetings and these technical visits that are being done in both directions. Professionals from the museum go to the Quilombo, they spend some days with them, getting to know the Quilombo, hearing an exercise of active listening, so we can understand what the association of the Quilombo São Pedro expects from this space, much oriented towards tourism. So how can we create a sustainable tourism? It already exists, but how can we promote it through the creation of this center of memory, of this museum of territories? We have been thinking of the Museum of Territory as a museum of practices, a circuit that the visitors would do at the Quilombo to get to know their practices, especially related to their traditional agriculture in the Quilombos. So the team goes there and they delve into their life. And the people from the Quilombo also come to the museum to get to know it, other cultural spaces, and also establish a dialogue with the team. And the result will be on June 24th, an exhibition with a shared curatorship between the team of the Afro-Brazilian Museum and the Quilombo São Pedro. So they are the ones who are choosing the works, the narrative that is going to be brought and told in this exhibition. It's called Roça é Vida, or Planting is Life. It's all created by the GT Quilombo São Pedro, of some people who have more affinity or feel more like developing this project with the museum, and they've been building it together, always in a participatory dialogue with the community. So I believe in this moment, we also have the development of a museological plan. It's a very special moment because the museum is in its first year after the death of its founder. And now we begin to rethink ourselves. So the museological plan has been done and conceived and discussed in a very participatory way, including all the professionals in the museum. We have more than 70 people working, hired, and about 25 people who are working autonomously. And all of them are participating in the construction of this museological plan that we have about 5 years ahead of us to build this new manner of internal participatory process. And the next stages, I invite you all, I believe some of you, I hope you can participate also the construction of an external collaboration. So we have a series of conversations and working groups that will happen in the next months. And we're going to separate invitations for the society and the radio and the social networks so society can participate in these conversations and bring what are their expectations, their desires, what do you expect, what would you like to see in the Afro-Brazilian Museum? What's the museum that society expects our museum to be? I'm sorry to interrupt you. I'd like to ask you to go towards the end. You only have 2 minutes now. So I believe that from the point of view, decolonizing point of view, maybe these practices, these participatory and collaborative practices, new perspectives, new narratives, new looks towards our collection, the presentation of the collection through a polyphony of multiple voices. I believe this is the moment of the museum that was already born within a decolonizing perspective, but it has to reinvent itself all the time. And only to conclude, I believe that this is the moment with the national Black movement. We had some people working with us in our administrative council in some more isolated actions in the museum, but I believe that participating in this reinvention, rethinking the museum in this such peculiar moment and such a sensitive moment, I believe this is the moment that we imagine that throughout these conversations, this participatory elaboration, we believe we can bring more people from the Black movement, more activists, more representatives of the Black movement to think along with the institution in the next years. I spoke too much. I didn't speak almost anything I wanted to say, but I hope we can talk a little later. It was excellent. I'm feeling bad in this role. I understand why Martin asked me to do this mediation. So because I have to cut the people with such potent talks, and I've been thinking to myself that what the museum, the Afro-Brazilian Museum does, maybe happens with all the cases shown here, which is to break the frontiers between an ethnographic museum, an art museum. These categories don't make sense anymore with these museums. The same objects, they could be in an ethnographic museum, or they could be shown as art, or none of those. So it's very fascinating. One other thing that I feel that could is the coexistence of the ancestors and the contemporary people, what is old, what is ancient, what is history, and what is happening now in a process of movement. All of this comes together. We have the Black ship, but we also have an artist who self-declares himself an indigenous, which is a very contemporary phenomenon here in Brazil, and discusses this condition in his work, what it means to be an indigenous, how complex this is. So you have everything there, the orixás, but also aspects of Brazil today. And I use this as a stimulus to introduce Michiko. I believe she's also going to talk about an exhibition that gathers these two aspects, the ancestral side and the contemporaneous side. We're colleagues in our department, but thank God we have this meeting at USP so we can meet, because we almost don't go on the same days to campus. Michiko Okanu Ichiki, is a master's and has a PhD in communication and semiotics by PUC. She's a professor in graduation and post-graduation of art history in the University of São Paulo. She's also a member of the post-graduation program in language, literature, and Japanese culture in the at USP, University of São Paulo. Michiko was the curator of two large exhibitions. The first one was called Common Look, Japan Revisited. She gathered 21 artists from Nipo-Brazilian artists in 2016. The second exhibition was called Trans-Pacific Borderlands, and it brought artists, Nipo-Latin artists, to 20 cities, Los Angeles, Lima, Mexico City, São Paulo. That was in 2017 and 2018. We asked Michiko to do a brief exhibition of one of these exhibitions to show how cultural identities are built through works of art and exhibitions. Because Michiko doesn't work with indigenous people, but somehow the work she's been doing is to think about how identities are built and thought of all the time, and how the museums and art are platforms, important platforms to think about these identities. So I pass the floor to you. Welcome. And I'll do as I did with the others. When we get to the end, I'll tell you. Good afternoon. I'd like to say that my talk here, as Ilana said, I don't do research on indigenous or primitive people, but I do research on a minor group, the Nipo-Brazilians. They are not known or recognized neither in Japan, very little known in Japan, and also little known here in Brazil, except for a few artists. I received more invitations to talk in the United States than here in Brazil. To talk about my research here in Brazil, I think it's the first time I'm being invited. I thank you very much. It's a great joy to participate in this meeting. My name is Michiko. I'm Japanese, and I was born in Hokkaido. My name is Michiko because I was born in Hokkaido, because the do means path to the North Sea. And this path, do, is also read Michi. There's another reading called Michi. So my name is Michiko because I was born there. There's a relationship between my name and the lecture by Professor Mariko. When I arrived here in Brazil, I arrived when I was 8 years old, more or less, in the middle of the 60s. And I was very segregated because I didn't know how to speak Portuguese. Sashimi, that today everybody knows, at least you've heard about it. It's present even in Brazilian barbecue houses. In those days, it was raw fish. And I remember a girl came to me and she said, "Oh, you eat raw fish, how disgusting." I was very traumatized because I was segregated as disgusting. And here in Brazil, I discovered that I was yellow, because in Japan, we don't have this consciousness that we are yellow. Now I'll begin contextualizing briefly the insertion of the Japanese people here in Brazil. The project of whitening already happened in the beginning of the 20th century. And the yellow people were considered inconvenient here. But the need for labor to replace the slaves opened the doors for the Japanese immigration. So the Japanese immigration started in 1908, and they went to work in the coffee plantations in São Paulo. But they came to stay here only a little, to get some money and leave again to Japan. Many intellectuals, they advanced with this movement anti-Japan, and in the new state with Getúlio Vargas in 1934, it was institutionalized by the Constitution, the decree of controlling foreigners here in Brazil. So we had the law of quotas, and only 2% of the Japanese immigrants could enter here, Brazil, annually. And so it was a time of ultra-nationalism, Japanese imperialism, and the yellow danger was born. The yellow people are dangerous. And this became intensified with the Second World War, when Brazil allied, and the Japanese suffered a lot of problems. So the liquidation of some companies was decreed with Japanese directors. Schools of children were closed. They were forbidden to speak Japanese, their maternal language. Radios were confiscated, newspapers were closed. So the Japanese that hadn't learned Portuguese because they were supposed to go back to Japan, they didn't have information, no newspaper, no radio in their own language. So there was a fight between the Japanese themselves, those who believed that Japan had lost the war, and those who believed that Japan had won the war. This is a different story. But we know that many of these problems were much less intense for the white immigrants. With the defeat of Japan in the war, the dream of going back to Japan ended. And so they've started becoming Brazilian. Some didn't want to become Brazilian. They didn't teach Japanese to their children, and others continued preserving the Japanese spirit. After this brief contextualization, I'm going to speak about some of the children and grandchildren of these immigrants, their art, their identities, with better identifications. That is part of my research. I'm going to begin talking about the first exhibition. I chose two exhibitions, the ones that you showed so kindly, and one of them is the Common Look, Japan Revisited, that was done in the Oscar Niemeyer Museum in 2016. The exhibitions of Nipo-Brazilian artists are very hard to happen. They happen in the anniversary of the Japanese immigration, 100 years of Japanese immigrants. So we gathered the Nipo-Brazilians to do an exhibition. But these exhibitions, in this one, I try to show the diversity. What does that mean, Nipo-Brazilian? I wanted to show the diversity of the term Nipo-Brazilian, but here I'm only showing some that are related to this identification. This is Alice Shintani. I'm showing you very quickly. Please come back a little. This one is called Hanafoda. It's a Japanese card game. So here we have the three first cards on the upper left side, in my left side, that make a direct reference to this card game, the aesthetics, the shapes. But we can see on the right side something that has to do with Afro-descendancy. The next one. She's one of the few recognized artists here in Brazil, Nipo-Brazilian artist, and so she did this exhibition Menas in the 34th biennial in São Paulo. This is Sandra Hiromoto. She's an artist from Curitiba. The next one, please. And here she gets the aesthetics of engraving kiweki that you've probably heard about. These are figures of women, pretty women. On the right side, on the bottom side, you can see a reference to the hokusai, but see the title, Say Hi Now. Say yes now. So she's speaking about the submission of Japanese women. It's a criticism towards Japan. Next one, please. The next person is Erika Kobayashi. These three women participated in the exhibition. She makes the ceremony of tea. She's rejected by a Japanese community because she has other issues. So she made a performance, for instance, in which she called, "This is not me, este no soy yo." So that way of preparing the tea was not herself. It wasn't the Nipo Brazilian. So she put a very seductive outfit. Japanese women would be horrified, and her legs out, preparing tea in the museum. This is Erika Kaminishi. She has a very interesting story because she was born in Mato Grosso. She used to live in São Paulo. Then she went to Tokyo as decassegue. So she went to work as labor in her teenagers. And so she came back to Brazil. And she returned to Japan to study her post-graduation course. So she studied art, and today she lives in Paris. She married a French guy in Japan. And she, for example, she showed, this is her second exhibition, Trans-Pacific Borderlands. I didn't do the curator of the whole, but only the curatorship in São Paulo. It was an exhibition that gathered, for the first time, the Nipo Latin artists. Here we have the Nipo Brazilians. In Peru, Nipo Peruvian, Nipo Mexican, Nipo Americans. But in this exhibition, we gathered in the same space these Nipo Latin artists. And here she calls it prunoplastos, the scientific name of the cherry tree. It's the symbol of Japan, the symbol of transitoriness in Japan. So she puts this artificial cherry tree, Chinese, and so therefore artificial and lasting, inside a plaque of Petri, as if it were supposed to be examined scientifically, this Japanese symbol. This has a lot to do with the discrimination she received as being a Nipo Japanese in Japan. Before, please. That's what she calls a garden. She's referring to the Zen garden in Kyoto, where Professor Mariko lives. It's a contemplative garden, very beautiful. And here we have a metaphor of this garden, but which is built made of rocks and sand. Here she places her work supposed to be doodled upon and completed by the public themselves. This is, I don't know if it's the last one. I don't know how many more minutes I have. 3 minutes. This is Casey Shiokawa. He's an artist that went to Los Angeles. He tried to study medicine 3 times and he couldn't do it. And then he went to Los Angeles, where his sister used to live. And then he began working as an artist. He studied, he did his master's. And the interesting thing is that he was a gardener of the Hollywood actor Marlon Brando. So he's an incredible person. He used to say, I am proudly Brazilian. But he used to say, but my spirit is Japanese. I met him in 2017. Unfortunately, he died in 2021, but he was only acknowledged in 2016 when there was an exhibition at the Hammer Museum. So he participated in biennials in Paris. He participated in this exhibition as well, that I'll show you his work in this exhibition. So he begins to work with assemblage. So he gets the material in the garbage, as well as the natural material from the garden of Marlon Brando, the trees that were thrown away, these natural elements, and he works on it. So he gives life to these plants that were rejected. So we can see a lot of dialogue between him and Japan, Brazil, and the United States. For example, we have the second work in the back, or a central work, but very low. It reminds me of Ikebana, the flower arrangement. So, wow, you realize that that was exactly what I wanted to refer to. But also on the right side and the left side, I have other works. On the right side here, I have a work that is called Marga Yuriko, the name of his sister, who has a clear African influence because his mother practiced candomblé. So we can see the diversity, the Brazilian diversity. And of course, he had a lot of contact with the Afro-Americans. So there's an influence, there's an African influence on his work. And on the left side, I have a work that is called Patina. Patina. He refers to a primitive people in the United States. In his works, we can see a combination between many cultures. So I try to show this so we can see that the identity, the identification, because we identify with the space, with the culture, the people. And this identification is not given, it is not fixed, but it's always in a process of construction. And these exhibitions somehow, I try in a certain sense, to decolonize, trying to bring the existence of this Nipo-Brazilian problem. Whenever I go to Japan, I always ask my friends, and I'm going to ask Mariko, please let me give a lecture about the Nipo-Brazilians so the Japanese students know that there are Nipo-Brazilians here and that Japan is not restricted only to the Japanese territory, but there are extensions, antennas, and that you should be connected to them. I think that's it. Thank you. Super interesting. So I was thinking of having a conversation among the participants that wish to make a comment to another participant in the panel, a question or some answer to a question that was already stated or a comment that was made. So I'd like to, I pass the floor. We have 20 minutes. I don't know if everybody wants to speak. The last one to speak will be Mariko. So they're asking the public to participate as well. I think this is fair. So if we can convince our organizers to give us another 5 minutes. I open to the public first, later. So we have a round. So everybody in the panel that wish to speak, and then later I'll open to the public. And then one last round of talk. I'll leave Mariko to the end. A few more minutes. Who wants to speak? Mariko can also ask a question to the others or comments. I raised my hand. I don't know if I can speak. We cannot see that your hand was raised. We can. Thank you. Thank you for the opportunity. I know it's a question by Susan Alson to Mariko. It's a question that has to do with the territory and the relationship between the Ainu and the territory. I'd like to compliment, because I was curious about this museum that she showed in the beginning of her talk. And I'd like to know the collections, because it seems to me that some of these museums were also founded based on private collections. And there was one of them, if I'm not mistaken, which collection was donated to the city, and it became the museum of the city. I don't have the names. But it seems to me that it's kind of related to our museum, that museums that were born out of private collections. And I'd like to understand the relationship between these private collectors, these founders of these museums that she showed with the Ainu people and the culture. If they are descendants, if they identify themselves as Ainu, this idea of belonging and building these collections. Thank you. Susan Alson, he also raised his hand. I only resumed the question that he made in his talk. If you can repeat, it would be very kind of you. Only to know what's the relationship with the land, because she spoke a lot about that. Some of them use the word we. And here, we indigenous people, we have a large relationship with nature, with the people, with ancestrality and memory. So I'd like to know if this relationship also has a meaning for them with the Ainu, between the Ainu and the land. The relationship between the land and nature and the cosmology of the Ainu and how they relate to it. I'd like to ask Suzilene if she wants to ask a question. I'd like to ask a question too. I'd like to know how they live spirituality, because that's what we live here, what we live in my culture, and not only in my culture, but in other people's spirituality is very strong for us. So I leave this question: how do they experience spirituality in Japan? Thank you. So I think I pass the floor to, we're going to gather many questions and then I'll open it again for the public. One thing that I cannot help commenting, when we saw the images of that digital fire in the museum, and Suzilene said that they actually do light a fire with fire inside the Kaingangi Museum. So the contrast, the different ways of showing fire, one when the indigenous choose the way, and one, I don't know who chose this digital fire. So I'd also like to ask you that.
Okay. So thank you for the questions. It's difficult to answer everything, but starting from the fire, yes, because it's a very important place for the Ainu culture, I think that is why the museum decided to, the new Upopoy museum tried to show it. But as many of you might have felt it a bit awkward, I think it is going beyond the limit as well, because somehow, okay, this is very complicated, because then you have to sort of understand how the museum exhibit is made. In Japan, it's not only the curator, but it's the exhibition company is really strong. And they really have the power to sort of design the display. And it's always like a negotiation between the curator and this exhibiting company, but they always want to you to use a lot of money using digital images, right? Or digital devices, right? And in the end, the museum will have a lot of interactive machines that will break very soon. So there's always, so I know that many of the curators in Upopoy also are not happy about the way it's exhibited. And the thing with the fireplace is, I think it's too much. Maybe because right now it's sort of like a trend to make the museum look really posh and fashionable, and really like a white Cuban contemporary museum. You know, the image. I think they wanted this really nice image, but then in the end, I think it sort of whitewashed the culture a little bit. But then it's really difficult when they tried not to show the culture as, like, you know, uncivilized, or you know, people from the past. Or, you know, because there's always criticism that Ainu culture is always represented in an old-fashioned way. They try to modernize it in a way. So the balance is very difficult, and I think I can also understand why they try to do it, but at the same time, some of the things are a bit whitewashed. That is the impression I get as well. And concerning the I think they mentioned two museums. The first one that Sandra was talking about is the Biratori Ainu Museum. And so they made a dam using the sacred land of Ainu. But and so that was like in exchange for that, they made a municipal museum using Kaya no Shigeru's collection. So it's already very political. And I'm sorry, I cannot speak for the Ainu people. So I can't really say how much they are attached to the land itself. But one thing I can say is that because after the war, the Ainu culture was really, the assimilation policy started from the Meiji period, meaning they were made less Ainu, right? And so the people also, except for some of the very, people who had a strong idea, a lot of the Ainu people also forgot their culture. And it was a culture that was really becoming extinct in a way. So and it was really, as I told you, it was only recent that, all of a sudden, okay, we need to preserve this Ainu culture became a movement. So in that sense, I think it's very different with the indigenous culture here, maybe. And so I really don't know how much they are attached to the land or how conscious they are about the fact that that the Japan has made their land Japan in a way. Yeah. So I don't know if this is the answer, but yeah.
Bom, eu vou então abrir para o público. Tá aí?
Now I'm going to open to the public.
Boa tarde.
Good afternoon to everyone. Martin, thank you. In this moment, I'm watching. I don't want to do a new conference because you're very competent in what you are doing. You don't need my aid, but I have some reflections that I'd like to share with you. I keep thinking and at the same time asking myself, I think there's a point of difference when the museum is organized or thought about from the point of view of the people who had their identities massacred, and when the museum is thought from the point of view of the state, an official organ, no matter how much this institution is committed with these people. And I believe that in the same proportion also we could think this movement that we've had of the African peoples to go to Europe and demand from Europe the return of materials that are there. The other day, very recently, the Wole Soyinka, the Nigerian writer, was saying at a conference in Rio that when he gets England and he goes to a museum, his desire is to request if he could get what is there. So thinking about this, I ask myself that from the point of view of the institution itself, or from the point of view of the very idea of creating a museum, if on the one hand, if there isn't, for example, a difference of desires or an ideological difference, while some museums are formed with the desire of exhibition, when the Brazilian indigenous and José Naldo also said that they intend to create a live museum, a museum that can translate or introduce the life and thoughts, a cosmogony, or a theogony that is not only represented through objects. So if there isn't already an ideological principle in the very formation of these museums. The other thing is that I keep thinking that called my attention in the talk, got lost. Now I got lost. About the Afro-Brazilian Museum, when Emanuel Araújo used to say that he didn't want to form a ghetto, that museum was meant for all the white and black people and foreigners. I don't know in which moment Emanuel said this, but it seems to me that all the experiences of organization, whether cultural, political, when they start from people or groups that were dominated, they're classified as ghetto. I think Manuel suffered this influence. But I believe that if we think of the creation or a perspective that is decolonizing, I believe that our narrative or our metaphors could also incorporate this feeling of decolonizing. Maybe not to think of these actions as ghettos, or not to let these actions be classified as ghettos, but replace this idea of a ghetto by the idea of quilombo. And so I think of Abdias Nascimento and Beatriz Nascimento thinking of this Brazilian praxis in the quilombos. And the other question that really called my attention and that remains as an issue for Michico, when do we use Nippo-African? Referring to the Brazilian identity, Nippo-Brazilian. This hyphenized identity that many Brazilians use, this hyphenized nationality. So I ask you, this Nippo-Brazilian, it is assumed from your generation or you that was born in Japan and came to Brazil as a small girl, do you consider yourself as Nippo-Brazilian? The generation of your parents, how do you assume this Nippo-Brazilian identity in a correlation when we think about Afro-Brazilian identity, but not all Brazilians, descendants of African people assume, identify themselves through this nationality. How can we continue with this name? And another issue is this difficulty. This is valid for the indigenous people and for the Ainu. How do you assume these processes of identification or these identity processes in a situation that already has social groups that do not need to assume an identity because they already have a given identity, a naturalized identity? So, for example, the white people in Brazil don't need to say Brazilian white or whatever. But we, Black people, we have to assume as a society, as an organized society, through identities, of racial identities, how do we still today fight this battle in the space of art? The discourse of art, what if it's through objects or through texts, is one of the discourses that speaks more about the identity of a people, of a group. I have all these questions, and thank you very much. I'd like to thank you very much for your reflections. I'd need another panel, a part 2 of this panel. As we have only a few minutes to end, unfortunately, I will not be able to pass the floor to everyone. I will ask Michiko, who has a very specific issue, if you can answer about this term, and then I'll pass the floor to Mariko for your final considerations, and I'd like to thank you if you could maybe approach the questions that were made. Thank you for your question, Conceição. This hyphenization, Nipo-Brazilian, in the United States is Japanese-American. So there's another connotation, also hyphenized. But I think it's interesting that you said Japanese African or Japanese African, very little used, but in 2018 or 19, the Japanese government elected a mixture of Japanese and Black as Miss Japan. And so the Japanese people, they complained, saying that the person did not represent the Japanese people. It was an attitude of opening to this diversity. And she said, I'm as Japanese as everyone else. I was created, I was born here. Only Japan considers Japanese people only according to the blood. If a person is born there, even being born here in Brazil, my children are Japanese and my grandchildren are Japanese because I'm Japanese. So there's this relationship of blood, but the younger generation depends a lot on the relationship established with the culture. As I said, there are families that denied the Japanese tradition and others tried to conserve it. And so the relationship, there's an artist, for example, her relationship with her father made her reject the Japanese culture. She didn't like the male and authoritative attitude of her father, so she didn't want to know anything about Japan, so she discusses this Nippo-Brazilian identity. Another famous artist, André Komatsu, he says, I'm not Nippo-Brazilian. I don't like to be called Nippo-Brazilian because I'm Brazilian. My topics are the social and political Brazilian issues. I don't know anything about Japan. I eat rice and beans. I'm married to a girl from Paraíba, so it's very varied. So there are other cases that I showed that have a very intimate relationship with Japan. Some even bring sometimes a stereotyped image or an imaginary idea of Japan that does not correspond to a true image. But how can we assume these identity processes? I think it depends on everyone, that according to what the researchers I've done and the artists, each one assumes a different position. And we have this freedom, thank God, of assuming and showing in our work what each individual wants to show. I think that's it. I don't know if I managed to answer your questions, but I hope so.
Okay.
Thank you for the question. Yes, I told you that right now only 13,000 people are identified as Ainu by the survey done by the Hokkaido, and we think there's more. But this means that a lot of people don't want to say that they are Ainu, right, or they have our Ainu roots. So answering your question, it's so that we already have a given identity of a Japanese, the Ainu people too. So they can do away without saying it. But right now, because they and I think a lot of the Ainu people felt ashamed of saying it because the society made them think so. But now, with this issue of political diversity, they are trying to redefine themselves. So I think this mentality will start to change. I might be a bit optimistic, but I try to be. Because, and I think museums could really be a hub or a site to do that process, because museums are a very colonial institution. So because they are colonial, it makes us think about how we have to decolonize in a way. And so I think recently this and diversity is something Japan really needs to acknowledge now, because as I said, we are a fairly homogenous society. We have been working that towards the homogenous society, but in reality, we have the Okinawans, we have the Ainu, we have the Zainichi Koreans, and also we have a lot of the Nikkei Brazilians that came back to Japan in the 90s to work. So and right now, I think 2% or more of the population is foreigners, but it will become more and more in the future. So and as a country, we can no longer stay homogenous anymore. So this idea of decolonizing and also thinking about diversity is crucial for Japan as a country to exist in a way. That is what I think. So I'm thinking that hearing all the stories that and the presentation today, I was really touched by the difference in the standpoint of everyone, and the difference in but also the open channel to try to communicate. And it was really impressive that that you are all involved in museums, and so I think this channel is very important right now. And I'm only in Brazil for 1 week, but I really felt what Martin told me, this term, structural racism, right? And I really felt strongly this power at stake. And there's a strong power to sort of not to diminish it, but to maintain this structure of poverty and racism at the same time. So in a way, I thought, because Martin took me to several museums, and I thought the museums really could help in trying to communicate this. And because, the museums are mainly used to be for the white rich people, right? So for them to see what's going on and what we have to think about, it's so, I don't like to say that museum is an education center, right? Because it's not only that, but it is in a way an education center, in that it communicates what we have to think about and what's going on right now in the world. So so thank you very much. I'm sorry, I'm it's quite difficult to because I'm in a different country, and I don't know all the context here, it's very difficult for me to give a clear comment. But my brain is really working right now. Thank you very much. And I would like to keep thinking about it. And I would also like to keep communicating with you if that's possible. Thank you.
Acho que a gente vai encerrar o nosso evento aqui. Que horas deliciosas.
I think we're going to end our event here. They were delicious hours. Thank you for everybody who participated and who translated.
Só para vocês saberem, eu tinha preparado.
I had prepared a talk in case we had time. Now it sounds ridiculous to have prepared this talk, but it was good. So thank you all very much. The best regards. Let's keep in touch, and we finish here.